The year was 1692, and the small village of Salem lay cloaked not in the morning mist, but in a palpable fog of fear and suspicion. Its narrow, dirt streets wound between weathered wooden houses, each shadowed by the heavy weight of unspoken dread. The Puritan community, bound by rigid faith and tradition, had become a crucible where neighbor eyed neighbor with suspicion, where whispered prayers mingled uneasily with whispered accusations. It began with a tremor, barely noticeable at first, but soon the tremor grew into a tremulous roar that would shatter lives and unravel the fragile threads holding the village together. In the heart of Salem village, a handful of young girls convulsed with strange fits, their bodies racked by invisible torment. Their cries echoed through the meeting house and into the homes of families already burdened by hardship and the harshness of frontier life. The village elders, steeped in the belief that the devil's hand could be found lurking in the shadows, saw in these afflictions a sinister truth. Witchcraft had taken root among them. The hysteria was not born of reason, but of a collective fear that seeped into every corner, turning reason into suspicion, suspicion into accusation. Sarah Good was the first to be named. A poor woman, scorned and marginalized, she had long been an easy target for the village's disdain. Her ragged clothes and biting tongue made her an outcast, a scapegoat for frustrations that had no other outlet. When the girls screamed that Sarah's specter had clawed at them in the dead of night, the community accepted this as proof enough. The law of the land was swift and merciless. Accusations were treated as confessions, and confessions as sentences. Alongside Sarah, Tituba, a slave from Barbados who served the Reverend Paris's household, found herself ensnared in the growing net of suspicion. Her foreign tongue, unfamiliar rituals, and status as an outsider made her a convenient vessel for the village's fears. When she confessed under the pressure of interrogation, naming others as witches, the floodgates opened wider. The accusations multiplied, each one feeding the next, like a wildfire ignited by a single spark. The fabric of Salem's society began to unravel. Families were torn apart, friendships dissolved, and the very notion of neighborly trust disappeared beneath waves of paranoia. The Puritan community, which had prided itself on order and piety, found itself consumed by chaos and suspicion. In this crucible, women, especially those who deviated from the expected roles or who lacked male protectors, became the primary targets. Widowhood, outspoken behavior, poverty, or even simple misfortune were enough to cast the shadow of guilt. The trials that followed were not mere legal proceedings, but instruments of social control, mechanisms that weaponized superstition and fear to reinforce existing hierarchies. In the tightly knit, patriarchal society of Salem, women were expected to be silent, obedient, and submissive. Yet many of the accused defied these expectations in ways that unsettled their neighbors. Sarah Good's sharp tongue, Tituba's unfamiliar customs, and others' quiet independence became acts of rebellion in a world that demanded conformity. The trials transformed these acts into crimes, painting the accused not only as witches but as threats to the social order itself. Behind the closed doors of courtrooms and jails, the suffering of these women was profound and often overlooked. They endured not only the public spectacle of accusation, but the private torment of isolation, fear, and betrayal. The community's hysteria turned neighbors into enemies, and even families could not always shield their own. The women faced not only the threat of death, but the annihilation of their dignity and identity. Among them, Sarah Good sat in a cold, cramped cell, her spirit battered but unbroken. Her eyes, once sharp and mocking, now held a haunted weariness as she awaited her fate. Tituba, trembling and broken, recounted tales that both condemned and sought to save her, caught between the desire to survive and the weight of her confession. Their stories, though different, were bound by a common thread: the merciless grip of a society that sought to root out its perceived evil by destroying those it feared most. Outside the confines of court and jail, the village pulsed with a feverish energy. The marketplace buzzed with whispered rumors. The meeting house echoed with sermons warning of the devil's presence. Children played under the ever-watchful eyes of their parents, who taught them to fear and distrust. The hysteria was a contagion, spreading faster than any illness, infecting minds and hearts with suspicion that would not be easily cured. Yet, beneath the surface of panic and accusation, there were moments of quiet resistance. Some villagers hesitated, questioning the validity of the claims, sensing the injustice creeping into their midst. But fear was a powerful silencer, and the weight of collective panic often drowned out the voice of reason. The machinery of accusation churned onward, relentless and unforgiving. In the homes of the accused, the atmosphere was one of trembling uncertainty. Mothers clutched their children, husbands wrestled with disbelief, and daughters tried to understand the shifting tides that threatened to swallow them whole. The bonds of family were tested as accusations spread like wildfire. No one was safe, not the poor, not the socially awkward, not even those who had once been pillars of the community. The invisible line between innocence and guilt blurred with every whispered name. The Puritan belief in predestination and the constant presence of evil created fertile ground for the hysteria. To the villagers, the devil was not a distant force but an immediate, insidious threat, one that could manifest in the form of a neighbor, a friend, or a relative. In such a world, doubt was a dangerous luxury, and accusation was a weapon wielded with fervor. The trials became less about justice and more about survival, both spiritual and social. As the first women were summoned to stand before the court, the air was thick with tension. The judges, clergy, and townsfolk gathered in the meeting house, their faces a mixture of fear, conviction, and morbid curiosity. The accused, trembling and isolated, faced accusations that were as intangible as the fears that fueled them. Spectral evidence, dreams, and visions that defied logic yet held the power to condemn. The courtroom became a stage where reason was eclipsed by superstition, and where the fate of women like Sarah Good and Tituba was sealed not by proof, but by panic. The hysteria that had begun with whispered fears now roared into an unstoppable force, consuming Salem village in its path. Women, once neighbors and friends, were cast as witches, agents of darkness threatening the very soul of the community. In their vulnerability, they bore the full weight of a society unraveling, caught between faith and fear, justice and cruelty. And so, the wheels of accusation turned, grinding slowly but inexorably toward a reckoning that would leave scars on the land and in the hearts of those who lived through it. The story of Salem was no mere tale of superstition, but a tragic reflection of how fear can fracture a community, how power can be wielded to destroy the vulnerable, and how the shadows of suspicion can consume even the brightest light of reason. In the dim light of Salem's humble homes, the women accused of witchcraft bore not only the weight of suspicion, but the crushing burden of a society intent on defining their worth through the narrow lens of puritanical order. The strict codes that governed their lives left little room for deviation. To be a woman in 17th-century New England was to live within rigid confines, silent, obedient, and subservient to the patriarchal framework that shaped every aspect of existence. Yet, in this unforgiving landscape, many of the accused had dared, in small but significant ways, to step beyond the boundaries imposed upon them. The village's moral compass was unwavering. A woman's role was to tend hearth and home, to bear children, and to uphold the spiritual sanctity of the family. Those who strayed, whether through widowhood, economic independence, or outspoken behavior, became shadows in the community's collective consciousness, figures simultaneously feared and envied. Their defiance, intentional or not, unsettled the fragile order and made them targets for the ever-growing tide of accusations. Bridget Bishop, the first to stand trial, embodied this uneasy defiance. Her spirited nature and reputed sharp tongue had long set her apart from the demure women expected by the village elders. A tavern keeper by trade, Bridget was known for her laughter and boldness, traits ill-suited to the austere Puritan world. When she was accused, the charges against her were as much about her social transgressions as they were about supposed dealings with the devil. Her case became a symbolic battleground, where the community's fears about female autonomy and social disorder were played out with devastating consequence. The interrogation chambers were cold and unforgiving, filled with the echoes of whispered confessions and cries of despair. The accused women faced relentless questioning designed not to uncover truth, but to elicit the names of others and secure confessions that would reinforce the fevered narrative of witchcraft. These sessions were psychological crucibles, where the boundaries between reality and terror blurred, and the women's resilience was tested beyond measure. The methods employed were cruel and calculated. Accused women were subjected to intense scrutiny of their words, gestures, and even dreams. The community's fear manifested in accusations of spectral evidence, claims that the devil's spirit had visited victims in invisible form. This intangible proof became the cornerstone of the trials, a weapon forged from superstition that left no room for defense. The accused were trapped in a labyrinth of suspicion, where denial was futile and admission, often coerced, meant damnation for others. Among those caught in this web was a widow whose quiet independence had long unsettled the village. Her refusal to remarry and her management of her late husband's estate marked her as different, a woman wielding power that challenged the prescribed order. To the community, such autonomy was dangerous, a crack in the foundation of their rigid society. The trials magnified these fears, painting her, and others like her, as agents of chaos and evil. The psychological torment extended beyond interrogation rooms. Public shaming became a tool to isolate and break the accused. Neighbors who once exchanged greetings now crossed the street to avoid them. Children were warned to beware, taught that these women consorted with darkness. The accused bore the heavy burden of not only defending their innocence but enduring the silent condemnation of a community that had turned its back on them. Yet, amidst the cruelty, there were moments that revealed the strength and humanity of these women. Bridget Bishop, facing her accusers in court, stood with a defiant spark in her eyes, refusing to bow wholly to the injustice arrayed against her. Her resilience became a beacon to others, a testament to the indomitable spirit that refused to be extinguished, even as the noose tightened. Her story was not one of submission but of resistance, a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to silence her. The widening circle of accusations fractured the very fabric of the village. Families found themselves divided, torn between loyalty and fear. The atmosphere grew thick with distrust, as neighbors whispered behind closed doors, wondering who would be next. The psychological toll was immense. The community's collective paranoia fed on itself, spiraling into a frenzy that few could escape. In homes where accused women once felt safe, the walls now seemed to close in, suffocating and unyielding. Mothers struggled to comfort their children while grappling with their own fears. Husbands wrestled with the impossible choice between standing by their wives and protecting their families from suspicion. The trials did not merely punish individuals. They shattered the bonds that held the community together, replacing trust with suspicion, love with fear. The gendered nature of the persecution was unmistakable. Women were cast as embodiments of evil, their very existence portrayed as a threat to the moral and spiritual order. The trials became a stage upon which deep-seated anxieties about female autonomy and power were played out with devastating effects. The accused were not simply victims of superstition. They were casualties of a society struggling to contain its fears through the subjugation of women. Within this crucible, the accused found themselves at the mercy of a system that denied them voice and agency. Their protests of innocence were dismissed as lies or the devil's cunning. Their suffering was rendered invisible beneath the spectacle of trials and confessions. Yet in whispered prayers and stolen moments of solidarity, they clung to fragments of hope and humanity. The community, meanwhile, was caught in a relentless spiral. Each confession, each accusation, fueled the next, turning neighbor against neighbor in a tragic dance of suspicion. The psychological torment was not confined to the accused, but spread to all who lived within the village's walls. Fear became a currency, exchanged and traded, binding the community in a shared but destructive hysteria. As the days passed, the trials revealed not only the fragility of justice but the corrosive power of fear and prejudice. The women who stood accused were more than names on a list. They were symbols of a deeper conflict, a struggle between conformity and individuality, between control and freedom. Their stories, marked by pain and resilience, whispered a warning about the dangers of a society that sacrifices compassion at the altar of order. The seeds of destruction sown in Salem were watered by the psychological torment inflicted on its women. The trials were not merely about witchcraft. They were about the control of bodies and voices, about the punishment of those who dared to exist beyond the narrow confines prescribed to them. In the faces of Bridget Bishop and the others, one glimpsed the fierce humanity that refused to be erased, even as the darkness closed in. And so, the village held its breath, caught between the past and the unknown, as the trials unfolded, a grim testament to the perils of fear unrestrained and to the quiet courage of those who faced it. The cold stone walls of Salem's jails pressed in close, squeezing the breath from the women confined within. Their days were marked not by the rising and setting of the sun, but by the relentless passage of fear and uncertainty. Overcrowded and unsanitary, the cells were little more than tombs, where accused women waited, sometimes for months, cut off from the world beyond, from their families, from hope. The stench of unwashed bodies and despair mingled, a suffocating reminder that in Salem, imprisonment was both physical and spiritual. Sarah Good sat on the rough wooden bench, her hands bound but her mind restless. The cold bit through her thin garments, yet it was not the chill that gnawed at her soul. It was the knowledge that outside these walls, the town whispered, judged, and condemned. Her name was no longer her own. It was a brand, seared into the collective memory of Salem as a symbol of evil. Friends and neighbors who once passed her with a nod now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Isolation was her daily companion. The courtrooms were no sanctuary of justice, but stages for spectacle and cruelty. Trials unfolded beneath the stern eyes of magistrates and ministers, their faces etched with a mixture of piety and suspicion. The evidence presented was often dubious: a torn piece of cloth, a stray touch, or the testimony of a frightened child who claimed to see a spectral shape. Spectral evidence, the most insidious of all, allowed the invisible to condemn the visible, turning dreams and visions into capital proof. The accused had little chance to defend themselves. Legal representation was non-existent. Their voices were drowned by the cacophony of accusations and confession. When Sarah Good protested her innocence, her words were met with skepticism or outright dismissal. The court was less concerned with truth than with affirming the fears that gripped the community. The scales of justice tilted irrevocably against the women who stood accused. In the dim light of the meeting house turned courtroom, Bridget Bishop faced her accusers with a fierce dignity. Her eyes met theirs without flinching, though inside her heart a tempest raged. She knew the verdict before the first word was spoken. The community had already condemned her, but she refused to bow entirely to their cruelty. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of a woman who would not be erased, even as the noose tightened. The emotional toll was as brutal as the physical conditions. Days in prison bred despair and loneliness, and the stigma of accusation clung like a second skin, refusing to be shed even if one were released. Mothers mourned the loss of children they would never see again. Daughters wept for the fathers who had abandoned them in fear. The social ostracism extended beyond the prison walls, severing bonds and fracturing families. Public executions, brutal and merciless, became grim spectacles that drew the townsfolk in a morbid dance of judgment and fear. The gallows, erected at the edge of the village, cast long shadows over the land, a stark reminder of the price of suspicion. Women were led to their deaths not only as punishment, but as warnings to others, to silence dissent, to enforce conformity, to quell the rising tide of fear. Yet, even in these moments of despair, the accused sought to maintain a fragile dignity. Some, like Bridget Bishop, met their fate with courage, their final words ringing out as defiant echoes against the silence that death would bring. Their faith, often questioned or mocked, became a source of strength, a tether to a world beyond the cruelty of Salem. They prayed, whispered psalms, and clung to the belief that justice and truth might outlast the horrors inflicted upon them. The trials became public theater, but the real punishment extended far beyond the scaffold. Survivors carried invisible scars, shattered reputations, broken families, and the heavy burden of trauma. Their names were whispered in fear and contempt, their stories twisted into cautionary tales designed to reinforce the power of the ruling order. The community, though momentarily united in its hysteria, was left fractured and haunted by the legacy of its own cruelty. In the dim corridors of the jail, women like Sarah Good and Tituba endured the slow erosion of hope. Their bodies weakened by confinement, their spirits battered by betrayal, they awaited a fate often sealed before the first trial. Yet, within their souls flickered a stubborn flame, a refusal to be wholly consumed by the darkness that surrounded them. Outside, the village moved on, the gallows standing as silent sentinels over the land. Children played beneath its shadow, unaware of the suffering that had transpired there. The townsfolk whispered in corners, some haunted by guilt, others hardened by fear. The trials had left wounds not easily healed, a community scarred by its own hand. The women who faced imprisonment, trial, and public humiliation were more than victims of superstition. They were casualties of a society grappling with its deepest fears and insecurities. Their suffering revealed the fragile nature of justice when corrupted by hysteria and prejudice. Their stories, though often silenced, carried the echoes of resilience and the enduring human spirit. As the noose tightened around the necks of the accused, and the courtroom's judgment echoed through the village, Salem stood at the crossroads of faith and fear, justice and cruelty. The trials had become a mirror reflecting the darkest facets of human nature. Fear turned to frenzy, suspicion to execution. In the shadows of the meeting house and the gallows, the voices of the accused whispered truths that would one day demand to be heard. Years had passed since the last noose was cut down in Salem, yet the shadows of those dark days lingered like a persistent mist over the village and its people. Survivors, once branded as witches, struggled to reclaim their names, their dignity, and the fragile remnants of their shattered lives. They walked through the streets as ghosts among the living, their presence a reminder of a community's tragic descent into fear and injustice. The scars they bore were invisible but no less real, a legacy etched into the very fabric of Salem's history. Families of the accused wrestled with the heavy burden of suspicion that clung to their bloodlines. Children grew up hearing whispered tales of their mother's supposed crimes, their own identities tainted by association. The social ostracism endured long after the trials had ended, a cruel inheritance passed down through generations. The community, once united by shared faith and purpose, remained fractured by the wounds inflicted during those harrowing months. Yet, amid the lingering pain, a slow and painful process of reckoning began. Voices once silenced by fear and shame found courage to speak out, to challenge the narratives that had condemned so many innocent women. Descendants sought to uncover the truths buried beneath layers of superstition and prejudice, piecing together fragments of history from faded letters, court records, and whispered family stories. Their quest was not merely for facts, but for restoration, of honor, of humanity, of justice long denied. The Salem witch trials became more than a historical episode. They transformed into a cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria and the destructive power of unchecked authority. Scholars and clergy alike revisited the events, offering apologies and reflections that acknowledged the profound injustices committed in the name of faith and order. Public memorials rose where the gallows once stood, silent testaments to the lives lost and the lessons learned. In these acts of remembrance, the accused women were no longer merely victims, but symbols of resilience and resistance. Their stories illuminated the perilous consequences when fear overrides compassion, when prejudice masquerades as justice, and when society turns on its most vulnerable members. They became warnings etched into history's conscience, a reminder that the pursuit of truth and fairness must never be abandoned, even in the face of terror. Historical research unearthed letters penned by women like Sarah Good and Bridget Bishop, revealing voices rich with complexity, fear, hope, defiance, and unwavering faith. These documents humanized the accused, stripping away the caricatures imposed by hysteria and restoring their place within the community's shared story. The realization that these women were not monsters but mothers, neighbors, and friends deepened the collective reckoning with the past. The trial's aftermath also exposed the fragile nature of patriarchal authority in Salem. The persecution of women under the guise of rooting out evil reinforced existing power structures, suppressing female autonomy and reinforcing male dominance. The legacy of this gendered persecution lingered, shaping societal attitudes for generations to come. Yet, in remembering the accused as more than victims, there emerged a recognition of the strength and courage it took to endure and resist the oppressive forces arrayed against them. Communities beyond Salem echoed this reckoning, as the trials became emblematic of the perils inherent in scapegoating and injustice. The story transcended its time and place, serving as a universal admonition against the dangers of fanaticism, the abuse of power, and the erosion of civil liberties. It urged vigilance against the forces that seek to divide and destroy under the guise of righteousness. As descendants and historians pieced together the lives torn apart, they uncovered not only tragedy, but also acts of quiet heroism. Women who maintained their faith, who comforted one another in prison, who refused to relinquish their identity even as the noose tightened. Their whispered prayers and carved markings in jail cells became symbols of unyielding spirit, testaments that echoed beyond the confines of Salem's dark days. The community's journey toward healing was neither swift nor easy. Forgiveness was sought and granted, but memories remained etched in the collective conscience. The trials left an indelible mark, a somber reminder that justice must be grounded in reason and compassion, that fear must never trump humanity, and that the voices of the marginalized must be heard and respected. In the quiet moments of reflection, Salem's people confronted the ghosts of their past not to condemn anew, but to understand and to vow that such darkness would never again consume their land. The accused women, once silenced and forgotten, reclaimed their stories, becoming beacons of resilience and enduring symbols in the ongoing struggle for justice. Their legacy whispered across the centuries, urging all who would listen to remember, not merely the horror, but the courage that outshone it.